Well, you can turn in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 25. Genesis chapter 25. We about ready? Everybody there? It's amazing to think these sections we talk about in Genesis and how uneven they are. The last section, the section that dealt mostly with Abraham, but the son of Terah, these are the generations of Terah, right? That dealt with him, was like about 30% of the book, something like that, of the book of Genesis. This section here, about 10 chapters, it's 50 chapters in Genesis, you're talking about 20% of the book. It's really amazing to think about how short some of those other sections are and how dense they are, how much work is happening in such a small space in a lot of those other portions. But these next 2 weeks, we will be considering the next two sections, mainly just one, but there's one short one in here in chapter 25. So with that, why don't we go ahead and pray, and we will get started today. Heavenly Father, here we are once again, assembled together under the banner of Christ and seeking to hear and learn and remember from your word all that you've told us. We think of our need to hear from you. Example we have of the early church giving themselves to the apostles' doctrine and the teaching, and we want to follow suit. We want to glean from these stories all that we can and be changed, and of course that's what this review is all about, is to pick up the pieces and remember the things we've heard, so we might take these things with us. We might be equipped with them instead of just something we kind of vaguely remember, but rather lessons learned and examples read and promises understood and received. So help us in this, in Christ's name, amen. Well, today, again, we move on in this overview of Genesis. Lord willing, these next 2 weeks, like I said, we will be considering the next two told out sections in Genesis. There are 11 of them in the book. The first of those sections is only a few verses long, Genesis chapter 25, verses 12 through 18. That's 7 verses total. That's a pretty short section. And we'll just merely make some comment on that. We'll read portions of it and make some comment on that very briefly. The next section, though, has to do with what becomes of Isaac and the promises that God has made Abraham for the world, and that it was through Isaac that Abraham's offspring should be named. And so that's a lot that is handled there. So far in Genesis, Moses has shown us the important matters and developments that are necessary for us to really grasp all that God has been doing in the world. That's there. From the beginning, we start there and we move on through. And he has certainly slowed down and taken his time with Abraham, and he's getting ready to do so again with Isaac, Jacob, and Esau, and then Joseph after him. Moses' intention in doing all this is to help us to grasp God's purpose for blessing the world through a man in such a way that sets right all that the devil put wrong and restores us as people to an open relationship with God. In Abraham, this last section that we looked at, we've seen God act in the life of a man who was unworthy, but God acted as though he was worthy of this sort of interaction from God. In Abraham, we see that God is acting as though Abraham was a friend, someone to be supported and defended and partnered with, instead of a sinner to be judged. We also saw many instances in which Abraham sinned and deserved God's judgment, yet God disciplined him with grace, forgave him, restored him, taught him, and continued shaping him over time so that Abraham grew from a pagan sinner into a man of godly character. And all that, in a way, is kind of unexplainable that God would do that, except God had this purpose. And how he was going to justify acting this way wasn't yet revealed. That's something that comes later in the New Testament and is hinted at promise by promise throughout this Old Testament. But the last thing we saw Abraham doing before he died was acting in ways or the last group of things we kind of saw him doing was acting in ways to secure the blessings that God had promised him, to set up the next generation to receive them and to walk in them. For instance, he sought to get a wife for his son Isaac, and God wonderfully blessed that desire. He sought a wife for him not from the Canaanites, but from his own relatives. He made sure that any other children that he had, as he had other wives after Sarah had died, for sure, that these women and their children were sent away. They were taken care of, but none of them would be left with any claim on an inheritance from Abraham. They were sent away with gifts, and out they went. Or no inheritance with Isaac. And so that Isaac alone was the one in whom his offspring would be named, just as God had said. Isaac alone would be the one through whom the whole earth would eventually be blessed. Through Isaac. Isaac would be his lone heir in that sense. Once he passed away, the issue of God's dealings with the world along these lines that have been established now concern Isaac. And with that, God does with him what we read in these next chapters. We see God enter into his life and begin to do many wonderful things. We read well, we'll see it here later. I won't go to it now. So the question is, how does God's promise develop in the world in this next generation, in this son of promise? And the title of today's message is kind of along those lines, Learning to be a Son of Promise. Learning to be a son of promise. Before we dive into this material about Isaac, there is this brief section about Ishmael. This other told out section. These are the verse 12 of chapter 25. These are the generations of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's servant, bore to Abraham. And it goes on and tells us all this about him. Before Moses begins to answer for us this question about what becomes of Isaac, he turns to Ishmael. And it's kind of a curious thing, because I thought he already sent Ishmael off. We're done with Ishmael. We don't need to deal with Ishmael anymore. But you remember, God had made some other promises to Abraham about Ishmael. And so, kind of as the next chapter of the story is going to unfold, the question is, well, what's God going to do with Isaac? God made all these promises to Abraham concerning Isaac, and what's going to come? Well, before we dive into that and really flesh all that out and really look at the details of it, there's someone else that God promised to Abraham he would work in as well. And it was another son that Abraham had, Ishmael. And so, before you get all worried about what God's going to do with Isaac, understand all the things God promised Ishmael, he does those things too. Even when it wasn't, think about it, God has this purpose in the world that He's going to redeem the world. And Ishmael is irrelevant to that purpose. If anyone could be cast aside and forgotten, it would be Ishmael. Like there's no need for anything to happen in Ishmael's life at this point in terms of bringing this to fruition, bringing this promise to come. But there were other promises that God made. Remember reassurances to Abraham. Abraham says, no, that Ishmael might live. And he says, don't worry about him. Look, because you love him, I'll do some things for him. I'll be with him. I'll uphold him. I'll make him a great nation. He'll be fine. Don't worry about him. It's as though this was God's concession to Abraham. He told Abraham, you go get rid of the boy. And it's as though if Abraham would have said, yes, God, I'll do it, and he just did it, that things would turn out different for Ishmael. There wouldn't be these promises. But Abraham was unwilling. No, Lord. I love Ishmael. That Ishmael might live before you. And it's as though God's condescension to Abraham is, okay, I understand your great love for him. Because you love him so much, I'll give him these blessings, and then you'll be able to let him go, knowing that he'll have all these blessings. And so, is God going to make good on all those promises? I mean, there were these big central ones, but what about these lesser ones that were, maybe they meant a lot to Abraham, but they don't really matter to us. And what we see is, in this section, God fulfilled them perfectly. Everything that He said He would do, He did. And so now, when we come into, well, tell me then about Isaac. Well, you're primed to be fully confident that God's going to do all of these things. That whatever the failings of Isaac might be, whatever the failings of Abraham were, they haven't affected God's willingness to fulfill every word of His promise, even when it was irrelevant to God's main purposes. How much more confidence can we have in God's ability and His willingness and His faithfulness to carry out all of His promises? And so that's kind of how that functions in the book. There are several purposes for it. First of all, there's a need to demonstrate that Ishmael did not, in fact, inherit anything with Isaac, just like God commanded Abraham to not allow that. Second, there's the need to demonstrate to the people of Israel just who the Ishmaelite descendants were. They were going to have future dealings with them. But the third and the most important one is what I've already said, is that this account gives us great evidences of God's faithfulness on even irrelevant promises, or what seem like irrelevant promises. Every word is fulfilled. That's all I'm going to say about that, just in the interest of time. Now, we move into this next told out section. If only we could go through this as quickly, right? But then we'd miss everything, so we don't want to do that. The generations of Isaac. Now, that previous section we just discussed very quickly, even though it has to do with Ishmael, it's not so much about Ishmael, but rather about what became of God's promises concerning Ishmael. And this, in a similar way, this section is not concerning what happened with Isaac, but rather what happened concerning God's promises concerning Isaac and His purposes for the world. Having seen God work so carefully to begin His great redemptive purposes in Abraham, how does God carry that forward in the next generation after him? And how will they respond to His promises and His work? What happens next? Some of these stories that we read about don't in themselves sound all that important, just like some of the stories we read about Abraham didn't in themselves sound important until you put them in the larger context of what God was doing in his life. And then they all have this place and they fit together. And it's similar with Isaac. I mean, not every story here seems to be something that all of, the faithful forever need to know. But in this context, it's very important to know. So this is where we are. What are some things we learn in a review fashion here? What are some things we learn about Isaac? Well, first, at the beginning, Isaac is portrayed very well. You remember he's presented, he seems to have grown up to have been a rather submissive son. right? I don't mean submissive in the wrong way, but submissive in the way that a father would want his son to be submissive, even above and beyond that. Isaac seems to have been the willing, it seems, somewhat willing participant, or at least he trusted in his father enough to kind of let this whole thing go with the sacrifice, which seems just incredible. It's but a submissive son. He's presented also as a contemplative man who loved and valued his mother. In chapter 24, we read that he was out meditating in the fields, and that it wasn't until he had a wife several years later after his mother had died that he was finally comforted from having lost his mother. So relationships mattered to him. He loved and valued his mother. He was a thinker. He's presented as a loving and prayerful husband. We read that in Genesis chapter 24 as well. At the end of chapter 24, then Isaac brought her into the tent of Sarah his mother and took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. He's a loving husband. He's a prayerful husband. Look at what we have at the beginning of this section, Genesis chapter 25, verse 19. These are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham fathered Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah to be his wife, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Padan Aram, the sister of Laban the Aramean. And Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren. And the Lord granted his prayer. What a thing. He's presented as a prayerful man. He is presented as a believing heir of the promise. In Genesis chapter 26, we'll consider some things that come there as a believing heir of the promise. He responds to a famine in the land way better than his father Abraham did. And he seems to have responded better to the barrenness of his wife. I mean, Abraham ends up, with Sarah. With Hagar. Abraham's up, I hope he's with Sarah, ends up with Hagar in all of this because of the way he responded to the barrenness of his wife. But not so Isaac. He's praised to God about it, and God answers the prayer. It wasn't a quick thing. It was about 20 years after he got married before they had a child. So for 20 years she was barren, and how was his response? He was praying to God, not looking for another woman. It appears that Isaac will steer clear of many of his father's sins and shortcomings, but that's sort of short-lived. Sin is found in all of us, and Isaac's no exception. We soon find him stumbling in fear and unbelief, repeating the same foolish lies about his wife that his father gave about Sarah, she's my sister, in order to keep himself safe rather than putting his great confidence in God. Also, there's this matter of favoritism in the home we'll read about, preferring one son over the other, which just makes the conflict that the boys have between them all the worse. It extends and it deepens long into their adult years. It appears he has very little control and influence over his son Esau, and even Jacob for that matter, that he's really not much of a father figure to those boys, to those as they become men. He's rather easily deceived by his son Jacob. He's found to have been working in some measure even against God's stated intention for the two sons. And so it just kind of, in so many ways, he just seems rather weak as a man. But then again, we see him at the end reverse course on this. So he was deceived by his son Jacob. We find that he's kind of working against the express intention of God, somewhat knowingly, somewhat unknowingly. But then he reverses course on this when he realizes what he's been doing, and ultimately he seeks to pass on the Abrahamic blessings to Jacob while seeking to get him well suited in terms of his marriage. And these are his last words recorded in Scripture. So of Isaac, we learn about a man who gave in to fear for a period of his life, who was not a great parent, who worsened the conflict his children had between them, who sought to mitigate against what he thought were the unfavorable circumstances of God's plan for his children by pronouncing his own blessing upon Esau while he still could. But he was outwitted by his other son, and in that, he recognized the certainty of God's purposes, that no matter what he tried to do, God's purposes would stand despite his own actions, and even through the actions of men. He was even going to, his scheme to kind of go against what God had said actually was the very instrument that was used against him to allow God's purposes to stand. And from that moment on, every word we have from him is spoken in faith in God's promises, both to him and to his descendants after him. So we see a positive picture in general, despite the failings. That's an overview then of Isaac himself. With that, let's dive in a bit and see some of these early chapters, some of the material. In Genesis chapter 25, the beginning here, these are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham fathered Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah to be his wife. 40 years old. Then there are if we go down to verse 26, afterward his brother, when the boys are born, these twins boys, we'll read that in a minute. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. Then the boys grow up, verse 27. Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field. The boys grow up and become men. So he's 40 years old when he gets this wife, 20 years until she has the twins, and then later on we find them as men. And that's when the story picks up. Now they're grown men. And so we're talking at least 40 years here, right? If they're grown men, they're 20 anyway. So we're talking about at least 40 years of time that passes in these few verses. Now, what happens in these verses? Abraham, when he didn't have a wife, didn't have a child, was seen to be patiently waiting. Isaac was praying. What a thing. What an advance, right, on just waiting. He was praying, petitioning God. Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife. His life, the difference here, Isaac's life was different. He'd grown up with the advantages of Abraham's lessons. He knew firsthand and had witnessed God's provisions. He had the advantages of having learned many of these lessons already, and so he kept away from many of the mistakes his father had made. Isaac was praying. What do we read? The Lord granted his prayer, verse 21, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. The children struggled together within her, and she said, "If it is thus, why is this happening to me?" So she's pregnant. These kids are, she's pregnant with twins, and they're struggling together within her. It's not just they're moving. I feel like Angela and I know a little bit about this because she had twins. She certainly would know more than me, but I've witnessed it at least. Not experienced it, but I've witnessed it. But this is even beyond that, right? This is like when she talks to the maybe 3 or 4 other women, maybe 1 or 2 other women around that she might have dealings with who know of someone who had twins or who had twins themselves, and they describe their interactions and what it felt like, and she describes hers. They are either saying, "Oh, you're exaggerating," or they're saying something like, "This is not good." They're struggling with her in a way that she's very concerned. And she does something it's a bit unusual. I don't think we often think of it this way. She went to inquire of the Lord. It doesn't say she inquired of the Lord. She went to inquire of the Lord, which means she likely went to one of these altars that Abraham or her husband Isaac had established and built where they would worship and seek God. And she went there. So she left the house to go to the place to inquire of the Lord. She went. And the Lord met her. And the Lord said to her, "2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger." Now stop. Stop thinking right now about Jacob and Esau, and think for a moment about the promises of God to Abraham and to Isaac. And we read that, Abraham had one descendant, one son. That boy got married, and for 20 years his wife was barren. She finally answers prayer, and they have twins. We think, great, we're going to finally start multiplying here. And God says they're going to divide them. 2 different peoples, 2 different nations. It's crazy. 2 different nations are in your womb. 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. One will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. And it's like already all your expectations for how this would look are upended right at the beginning. But this is at the beginning of these stories because we're meant to take this information with us into the rest of the text. into the rest of the story. Everything will develop along these lines because God said it so. And this is where we are. We're prepared to look for certain things in the story. We should be expecting to find certain points proved out. Moses has thankfully put us in the same position in terms of perspective as Isaac and Rebekah. That is, we know before the children are born that the older one will serve the younger. We know there are two nations in her womb, two peoples will be divided. One, they will be different according to strength. There'll be a division among them according to strength and status and ability. All these things we're expecting. We don't know how they'll work out, but we know in the end the older will serve the younger. That's what we know. When her days to give birth were completed, behold, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, all his body like a hairy cloak. So they called his name Esau. Now, I don't know. I know different women are different. It seems like every mom loves the kind of babies that she has. So I know some women, they're like, oh, hairy babies are gross. And other women are like, oh, a baby with a full head of hair, that's like the only baby that's worth having. And I don't know, it's strange how God does that. But I don't know anybody that's like, oh, I want a hairy baby all over. That's kind of, I don't know. That's a little different. That soft baby skin, it's not there. It's just hairy. It's weird, right? Hairy baby. I don't know. And we all poke fun, right? Red hair, probably deep red, and then hair all over. He's given a name that means hairy, but I know some people named Harry, but they spell it different, right? But a name that means hairy, but which would have the word also has certain connotations of being kind of a rough handling man, rough of character, rough in manners, something of a brute. Another maybe crude way to say it would be like a knuckle dragger, right? He's just one of these guys that, very crude. But he's also it says that as he grows up, verse 27, when the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field. So what does he become? Well, it's not a man of the field like a farmer. He's a man of the field like you go out into the woods, into the wilderness, and you just go get your living out there. It's like that kind of fits like what you thought when he was born in his name. Like he's just kind of this rougher guy. He's kind of he's the Neanderthal guy, right? That's Esau. You just think of him in that way. He has every advantage in terms of his birth and his order of birth. He should have the birthright. He'll have the blessing. He'll have all those things. He's in the greatest, in a sense, in terms of redemptive history, in a parents you could have. His parents have more promises God has made them than any other family in the earth. They have more knowledge of God than anyone else. He has every advantage, and yet he's still kind of, when he was born, they named him this way, and it's as he was raised and became a man, at least in his profession or in his what he did to eat and to live and to make his living and his way in the world, he kind of was what you thought he was going to be. Kind of this rough guy, go out there into the woods and just get by. Jacob was different. The younger of the two, who had been told by God the older one would end up serving him. His first act of having been born, this is amazing, right? So, verse 25, the first came out red, all his body like a hairy cloak, so they called his name Esau. Afterwards, his brother came out with his hand holding Esau's heel, so his name was called Jacob. Now you can imagine, a child is born, and the first thing they do is grab hold of the heel of their twin. This is babies don't do this typically, right? We've all seen a newborn and put your finger in their little bitty hand and they grab hold, and sometimes they've got a grip. Sometimes you're shocked, but they don't go out there and reach and grab hold of the heel of their twin. This doesn't happen, but it happened. It was very unusual, which is why it's recorded for us. Not as just, oh, okay. Listen, you understand, from the earliest day, and they call him Jacob, which means someone who takes by the heel. Or you might have another translation in there which would be what this idiom would mean. Cheater. Like he's just always trying to manipulate the situation. Like when you play a game, like when Esau and Jacob played games together, Jacob kept changing the rules. That's how it happened. That was what we mean. It's this kind of thing. He's this cheater. It's always different. Everybody's looking at one of my kids. Right? So it's this way. So everything's always like, oh, well, now it's going to be different. Now it's going to be better for me. Now it's going to be better for me. Now, oh, wait, that's not good for me now. Now it's going to be better for me. It's always something that's better. This is the way it is. Now, here's this man, affectionately called cheater, right? But he grows up to fulfill it in ways you thought he never would. Like, it becomes work. Just like Esau, you think he's born this way, and you think, oh man, this kid's rough. And it's like, he grows up and he's rough. And here with Isaac, you think, oh, look at this little, what was cute and kind of shocking at first, look at this little cheater. Look at what he's doing. Just heel grabber. He's just trying to take it from his brother. You have no idea how bad it's going to get, right? Those innocent things that happen in childhood, a lot of times are left behind at childhood, but not so. These men grow up into becoming that kind of man. So with Jacob, he's a quiet man. Not that he's just a quiet man, absolutely, but particularly with comparison to Esau. He's a quiet man dwelling in the tents. He's not the crazy guy running through the woods, killing stuff and dragging it back and making it. He's there. He's man of the livestock. He's man of the field, right? The field where you plant your crop. He dwells in close with the tents. He's not out there for 5-6 days. He's not the shepherd who you send out, on a month journey. He stays here with everything. He's a different kind of person. Yeah, this is him. A little more sophisticated than his brother, for sure. So here's how these men are, how they've grown up. And we dive right in now. We read one other thing. Verse 28. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. And here again, we're setting the stage for what's going to come. And we think, man, so these boys are vastly different. There's these prophecies about how there's going to be division. And it would be bad enough if the parents loved them both equally, but the boys just couldn't get along and they divided. But what you see, what just cements the division and makes it bad and so bad early on, poisons the whole thing, is that the parents chose sides. And you can be sure Isaac at no point just said, I'm just thinking I'm going to decide to love Esau and not Jacob. But what happened was, as Esau grew up and became a man, and it's almost, you see, like it seems like when he was a man, the reason he loved Esau was because he ate of his game. Well, that's what Esau became as a man. Growing up, we're not exactly sure how they grew up, but once they become men, Esau is giving advantage. Esau is returning to Isaac with food and with game, and it is so good. And maybe they just shared that love and affinity for that kind of food. But it doesn't stay there. It works itself out into all of life so that this thing they shared became, that's not a bond about what they shared, but a bond for all of life, which excluded the others. Does that make sense? That's a lot of ways that's how this kind of thing happens. It's deadly, but this is what happened here. And so Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. So her response is, she sees this growing affection between Esau and his father Isaac, and she responds by showering the other son with all these favors. After all, he's God's chosen one anyway. He's the younger. The older will serve the younger. So she kind of takes that side. And, we could say, well, she's got more faith because she's choosing the one God said would be served. Not really. I mean, it's not. You don't get the idea that this is a faith. It's just kind of this response in the family. And so this happens. In their adulthood, Rebekah and Jacob become very close. Isaac and Esau become very close. And they're so close to the exclusion of the others, where it's one camp with two parties, in a sense. And so this is how it looks. Well, okay, so we go on. So what does this lead to? Well, once, sometime after the boys are men, when Jacob was cooking stew, and we think of stew, we think of meat in the stew. We shouldn't think of that because there was no meat involved, which we read about later. It was just beans and spices and water. This was maybe milk or something in there to thicken it up or something like that. But once when Jacob was cooking stew, Esau came in from the field and he was exhausted. And Esau said to Jacob, "Let me eat some of that red stew, for I'm exhausted." Therefore his name was called Edom. We don't see it here, but literally it's like this. And Esau said to Jacob, "Let me eat some of that red stuff that you boil, the red stuff. Let me have the red stuff." And he says it twice, and therefore his name was called Edom, which is another term for red. And so Jacob said, "Okay, sell me your birthright." And it's like, you have children and maybe one of them's older, the younger one. The younger one says, "Can I have a piece of candy?" to the older one. The older one knows the younger one has all this paper money that they don't know what's what. It says, for that dollar bill, I'll take it. And it's a 20 or something, and it's the stick of gum that you gave the older child for nothing, that kind of thing. And you think, no, you don't get to do that. You don't get to press for your advantage. It's not that Esau was ignorant of what the birthright was, but he's just so uncontrollable. He's just so willing just to be driven by his desires. He's so compulsive. And Jacob is so calculating and so always wanting to take him by the heel and take that advantage. He says, "I'll give it to you. You can have as much as you want, but it's going to cost you your birthright." And thinking surely that Esau will say, "Are you crazy? No, fine, I'll go get my own food." But he didn't. This is not a life-threatening situation. Esau arrives, Jacob is a man of the tents. And Jacob's cooking. Why could not Esau have said, "Never mind, I'm not paying that price. I'll go eat just whatever's left over from the other tent. Or I'll just eat tomorrow morning. Or I'll just go down by the well that we dug and get some water. Or anything." He wasn't starving. He wasn't going to die. He was just hungry. He was exhausted. It goes out of his way to say, listen, when Jacob was cooking stew, Esau came in from the field and was starving. No. It says was exhausted. He's just tired. Mothers, you'll understand this, and anyone who lives by themselves, you'll understand this. Anyone who has ever lived by themselves or ever been responsible for cooking your meals. There are sometimes you come home and you just think, "I'm not making anything." And you go to the store and you buy something ready-made. Or you reheat whatever's there. Or you just say, I'll eat tomorrow. You're just too tired. That's what it says. It doesn't say he was starving. It says he was exhausted. He was just too tired, too lazy. And so to save himself, to spare himself the expense or the time and the effort of making a meal, he sold his birthright. To have, and what was the meal? It must have been quite a meal. Right? No. Then Jacob, verse 34, then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went his way. It's staggering. But Esau so Jacob says, "Sell me your birthright right now and you can have it." And Esau exaggerates his situation. "I'm about to die. Of what use is a birthright to me? I'm so hungry, I'm going to die if I don't get something," which was not true. Right? How many of you kids ever talk about this? "I'm starving to death. I'm starving, Mom." No, you're not. It's been 3 hours since you last ate. And the meal's ready in 30 minutes. Don't tell me you're starving. Right? You're not starving. But Esau's a grown man. He's talking to his brother. I'm going to die. Look at me. I can't make it. Give me that. I'll give you my birthright. I can't inherit anything if I'm dead, so I might as well. No, that's not how it works. So he swore to him and sold his. So Jacob said, this is interesting, Jacob said, "Swear it. Swear it." Like these kinds of things get said to people or back and forth, and later on, like you could imagine without the sworn oath, you say, you sold me that, right? No, you knew that was not right for you to say. That's not a fair price. I just said it because I was hungry, and you're always this way. I'm not doing that. You're not going to get my birthright. But he says, look, here's the contract. Sign it. Swear an oath. Swear it. You can be sure they weren't alone. What good would a sworn oath be if there weren't witnesses? People were around. I mean, he was going to be held to this. Swear an oath. So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. And then Jacob, gladly, I'm sure, gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. Why is this story here? It's not here to tell us how the birthright ended up with one kid instead of the other, one son instead of the other. It's there to demonstrate to us Esau despised his birthright. So here we think about it. What have we been told? There are these warring nations in her womb, or nations will come from these men. They're separate peoples. They will be divided. One stronger and just kind of better suited than the other one. And you might think, well, that's Esau because he's a wild man. But you're learning it's Jacob. Like Jacob's actually stronger. He's outwitting him all the time. Outwitting Esau. Esau is, he might be physically strong, but he's weak like a man without self-control is like a city left without walls. He's weak. Jacob, however, is shrewd. So there's this division is happening in that sense. And it's also happening, we're told the older will serve the younger. And we see this, how this is going to work out. Esau is just he's so compulsive, he's so irrational, he's going to lose out on everything. He despised even his birthright, even the thing that he was guaranteed him by being he was just born first. So he's got all this advantage. He's going to get at least twice what his brother's going to get in the inheritance. Nope, gone. He didn't even care about it. And so you see the things that God said beforehand, they're working themselves out. Now there was a famine in the land, verse chapter 26, besides the former famine that was in the days of Abraham. Now he's telling us that, look, there's another famine. You think, oh yeah, I remember there's a famine. No, it's not the same one going on. That was a different time. But when he mentions Abraham by name in the famine of Abraham's day, you should be thinking, oh yeah, how was it Abraham handled that famine? What did he do? Anybody remember there was a famine in the land and Abraham did what? Where did he go? Egypt. He left the promised land. God said, this is the land. He said, it's no good here. I'm going to Egypt. He went to Egypt. So that's the question. What's going to happen? And Isaac went to Gerar, to Abimelech, king of the Philistines. And the Lord appeared to him and said, do not go down to Egypt. Dwell in the land of which I shall tell you. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you and will bless you. For to you and to your offspring I will give all these lands. And I will establish the oath that I swore to Abraham your father. I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and will give to your offspring all these lands. And in your offspring all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. So Isaac settled in Gerar. Now think of this. There's a famine where he's at. He's got grown men for sons now. He's been there for years and years and years where he's at. And there's a famine. So he packs up and he leaves somewhere else. He's still in the promised land. He hasn't left totally, but he's gone to a different area. He goes to Gerar, to Abimelech, a different Abimelech, but same people, same city, same everything, but Abimelech is a name for the king of that place. And so he goes to this Abimelech, and the Lord appears to him and says, don't go down to Egypt. Why would the Lord say don't go down to Egypt? He didn't go to Egypt. He's in Gerar. Well, he didn't settle in Gerar. There's a famine. He leaves. He goes to Gerar, and evidently he's got fears in Gerar. He's not happy living in Gerar. And he's thinking, I need to go somewhere else. And God intervenes and says, don't you dare go to Egypt. I want you to stay here. And if you will stay in this land, I will give it all to you. I will establish this covenant. You see? And so he stays. In faith, he stays. God had to intervene, but he responds better than Abraham, who left. He stays. But there's still this matter of fear. He didn't want to stay in Gerar, but he did so because they had food there and because God told him not to go to Egypt. So Isaac settled in Gerar. When the men of the place asked him about his wife, he said, I remember Dad said this, she's my sister. She's my sister, guys. She's my sister. That'll work. Not a good idea. For he feared to say my wife, thinking lest the men of the place should kill me because of Rebekah. I mean, I can't count the number of places, I don't think there's been anywhere that I've been in my life where I felt like people might just kill me, take what belongs to me. Like whether it be my wife or my children or my things. I've never been in a place where I felt like just being there, they're going to see what I have and kill me and take it. But he's in that position, right? And he thinks they're going to take Rebekah because she was specifically attractive in appearance. When he had been there a long time, notice, Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked out of a window and saw Isaac laughing with Rebekah, his wife. So Abimelech laughing, there's a kind of playful flirting, this sort of thing. Laughing is a euphemism, but it's a euphemism used in the Bible itself in this place. Just has, you might say, teasing with her. And if I said, husband and wife were they were out on the back porch teasing each other, he'd say, what do you mean by that? And just, we understand it's a broad term that could mean lots of different things. And so Abimelech called Isaac and said, behold, she is your wife. How then could you say she's my sister? You lied to us. And Isaac said to him, because I thought lest I die because of her. And Abimelech said, what is this you have done to us? One of the people might easily have lain with your wife, and you would have brought guilt upon us. So Abimelech, in a sense, acknowledges, look, you shouldn't have done this, because what happened is when you did that, it could easily have happened that one of the men just went and laid with your wife, took her as a matter of possession, had their way with her. And then that would have been such guilt for us, not only because they had done that, but because they'd done it to a man's wife. And we would have not known, and you would have brought guilt upon us. Right? So Abimelech warned all the people, saying, whoever touches this man or his wife shall surely be put to death. So he provides some protection for Isaac. So what happens? Isaac sowed in that land and reaped in the same year 100-fold. 100-fold. He reaped 100-fold. This is incredible. There's a famine. He sows and reaps 100-fold. Bumper crop. I mean, this is God's blessing him. And it says that. The Lord blessed him, and the man became rich and gained more and more until he became very wealthy. Now, typically, when people talk about, like in times of recession is when fortunes are made, they'll say that. They don't typically mean like you actually make the fortune, then they mean the investment, the outlay of your money goes out, and then when things recover, you are super, super wealthy because everything kind of everything's making money, and it's exponentially better than it was before. They don't mean when things are terrible in times of famine, farmers have bumper crops. That's not what they mean. They don't mean when things are really bad, people just get really rich. That's not how it works. Not in that sense. But that's what happened for him. In the time of famine in the land, he was gaining and growing in prosperity. He became rich, gained more and more until he became very wealthy. He had possessions of flocks and herds and many servants, so the Philistines envied him. Now, there's some information you need to know. The Philistines had stopped and filled with earth all the wells that his father's servants had dug in the days of Abraham, his father. You remember there was a time when Abraham had been over there. And they had had some problems with the wells and stuff. So Abraham's out there in the desert, not in the prime spot where the town was, but out in the fields around there. And the people are leery of him being there. They don't really like it. But it's not so bad because it's not really the place you would settle. You can't really prosper out there very good. That's why they're where they are. But Abraham, smart, he starts digging all these wells. Everywhere there's water runoff, he digs a well so that it holds the water, so that now it becomes a watered place, so that his flocks can have water and they can survive. And so he's improved the land. Well, then when Abraham leaves, the people are like, we don't really like people just kind of hanging out here. So they go and they filled with dirt all of those wells, so that now when people came through, it wasn't a nice place to settle. You just wanted to keep moving, thank you, and they didn't have to worry with it. Well, so now Isaac's here, and what does he do? Well, so anyway, so they had filled all these wells in, and Abimelech said to Isaac, "Get out, get away from us, for you are much mightier than we." So Isaac left from there and encamped in the valley of Gerar and settled there. So he leaves the city of Gerar and camps out in the valley. And Isaac dug again the wells of water that had been dug in the days of Abraham his father, which the Philistines had stopped after the death of Abraham. And he gave them the names that his father had given them. He sort of he remembers he was with his dad when all this was going on, and he's renaming them. He remembers what these names are. And he's reestablishing this kind of a settlement out there. But when Isaac's servants dug in the valley and found there a well of spring water, the herdsmen of Gerar quarreled with Isaac's herdsmen, saying, "The water is ours." So you got to imagine the situation. They're out there redigging all these wells where rainwater will pool up. And the guys, the herdsmen of Gerar, that nearby city where they've just been kicked out of, are willing to kind of let that go because they all kind of benefit from it a little bit. It's fine. But then they're digging another well, and lo and behold, they hit water, and it's a spring. And now the herdsmen of Gerar are saying, no. That's ours. We get the spring. You guys you keep redigging your wells, but we're gonna get the spring. You don't have access to that. So he called the name of the well, that spring, Ezek, meaning contention, because they contended with him. So he lets them have it. They go and he digs another well, and they quarreled over that also. So now the guys are saying, these guys, now that he's hit spring water, the thought is that these men of Gerar, these guys are going to settle here, and it's going to become good for them. We can't let this keep going on. And so he digs another well, and they come and they quarrel over that one. And so he called its name Sitnah, which means enmity. And he moved from there and dug another well further out. But they didn't quarrel over that one. So he called its name Rehoboth, saying, "For now the Lord has made room for us, and we shall be fruitful in land." We finally got enough distance away from them that we can not have to quarrel about everything. So from there he went up to Beersheba, and the Lord appeared to him that same night and said, "I am the God of Abraham your father, fear not." Why would he be fearful? Because of just all these interactions we've been reading about. "Fear not, for I am with you, and I will bless you and multiply your offspring for my servant Abraham's sake." So he built an altar there and called upon the name of the Lord and pitched his tent there, and there Isaac's servants dug a well. When Abimelech went to him from Gerar with Ahuzah his advisor and Phicol the commander of his army, Isaac said to them, "Why have you come against me, seeing that you hate me and have sent me away from you?" And they say, "We see plainly that the Lord has been with you, so we said, let there be a sworn pact between you and us, and let us make a covenant with you, that you will do us no harm, just as we have not touched you and have done to you nothing but good, and have sent you away in peace. You are now the blessed of the Lord." They recognize, they see that God is with him. They have seen it. I mean, they saw, first of all, the way he sowed in the land and reaped 100-fold. They saw all that he gained during this time of famine. As the famine started to lift, and he's out there, they sent him out there. He's willing to redig all these wells. He's getting water. They strike a spring. They've been out there. They've never hit spring water, but they've got, Isaac's got one, and they're jealous of that. They drive him out there. He gets another well. They drive him out from that one. He finally gets another. He's far enough out, and they just realize, look, this guy's kind of here to stay. We can't keep chasing him out and out and out and out. Like, we're kind of at the end of where we can defend. And we just need to make peace with him. Because God's with him. He's going to keep getting better and greater, and we better make peace. And so they do. They seek to make peace. And so Isaac does this. He made them a feast, and they ate and drank. In the morning they rose early and exchanged oaths, and Isaac sent them on their way, and they departed from him in peace. That same day Isaac's servant came and told him about the well that they had dug, and said to him, "We have found water." And he called it Sheba. Therefore the name of that city is Beersheba to this day. He gives it the same, it's kind of out in the same area his father Abraham had been digging, Beersheba. Gives it this, establishes that name. When Esau was 40 years old, now Esau's 40 years old. he took Judith, the daughter of Beeri the Hittite, to be his wife, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite, and they made life bitter for Isaac and Rebekah. So now, we have read in this chapter more about Isaac and the way God has been with him, to defend him, to sustain him, to teach him, to bless him, to be patient with him, to forgive him. And all of these things have happened. He's blessed of the Lord. Others are acknowledging it. Others are receiving from him some of this blessing, even though it's just mainly physical things they're receiving, but they're receiving from God's blessing upon him. But all in that context, Esau has grown another 15, 20 years, and he's 40 years old, and he takes as wives, plural, 2 women, 2 Hittite women, and they make life bitter for Isaac and for Rebekah. And so again, we see Esau's just complete failure, his disinterestedness in all of this. I mean, he's witnessing God's faithfulness. These pagans are saying, you, Isaac, are blessed of the Lord. We want in on this. We know if we don't avail ourselves of the blessing that's upon you, things will go badly for us. We're seeking to covenant with you that we might be blessed in some way along with you. Meanwhile, Esau, just opposite of that, growing up in the home, sees this and doesn't say, this is precious, this is good. My father's blessed of the Lord, I want that. Rather, he marries the pagan women of the land and they make life bitter. They come into the camp and Esau's just living their lives with them in the camp rather than seeking to live like Isaac following God. It's awful. So Isaac eventually becomes old. We know that this is actually another 37 years later. 37 more years of this. His eyes were dim so that he could not see. He called Esau, his older son, and said to him, my son. And he answered, here I am. And he said, behold, I am old. I do not know the day of my death. Now then, take your weapons, your quiver and your bow, and go out into the field and hunt game for me, and prepare for me delicious food, such as I love, and bring it to me so that I may eat, that my soul may bless you before I die. Now he's scheming, right? Isaac knows the older will serve the younger. Isaac knows that Esau sold the birthright. So Esau's future is going to be, and the future of the nation that comes from Esau, there's going to be further division that comes. They're going to be separate nations. They're not going to be in the same camp. But this division that's going to come. But Esau is going to be serving his brother, or his descendants will at least. And he doesn't have the birthright which he should have had. But he's going to bless him. He wants to do something for him because he loves him. He's his favorite. So he calls his son and says, look, son, privately. These things, normally these blessings are publicly done. But he wants to do it private where nobody can object. And he says, look, I want you to go out and you're going to get all your food that I want. I want a special meal. I want you to do it a certain way. You know how I love, that's my favorite meal. I want you to make my favorite meal. We're going to share that together. That's why I love you anyway, right? And one more time, we're going to share this thing that's knit us together and we've bonded over your entire adult life. Let's share it one more time. And after you give it to me, I'm going to give you this blessing. So there it is. This is what's going to happen. And so Rebekah hears it, though. Was listening when Isaac spoke to his son Esau. So when Esau went to the field to hunt for game and bring it, Rebekah said to her son Jacob, I heard your father speak to your brother Esau, bring me game and prepare for me delicious food that I may eat it and bless you before the Lord before I die. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice as I command you. Go to the flock and bring me 2 good young goats, so that I may prepare from them delicious food for your father, such as he loves. And you shall bring it to your father to eat, so that he may bless you before he dies. So this is her scheme. So Isaac's got a scheme. I'm going to try to secretly, so nobody objects, because they know that really Esau shouldn't get these blessings, but I can't stand not to give it to him. I'm going to give him a blessing. Rebekah hears it and says, oh, no, you won't. Blind man, we're going to trick you. And so they set out to do that. Now, this is remarkable on a number of fronts. Jacob's nervous about it. His mom tells him things he can do to disguise himself. And he says, well, what happens if I get cursed? And she says, let your curse be on me, my son. Only obey my voice and go bring them to me. So she's out. She loves her Jacob, and she wants to make sure Jacob gets the blessing. So they enact her plan. And we'll skip on down to verse 18. So he went in to his father and said, my father. And he said, here I am. Who are you, my son? Because it maybe didn't sound like, he's got two boys, and I don't think they sound super similar, but maybe they do. But he's trying to sound, there is a distinction in the voice as he gets to later on. So he's imitating his brother's voice. Who are you, my son? Jacob said to his father, I am Esau, your firstborn. He's trying to do all he can to appear like Esau. He says, I have done as you told me. Now sit up and eat of my game, that your soul may bless me. But Isaac said to his son, how is it that you have found it so quickly, my son? Right? It typically was hours and hours, and this was kind of really fast. How did that happen? And Jacob, ever willing to lie to gain the upper hand, says, because the Lord your God granted me success. The Lord your God granted me success. What a lie. And he does it in God's name. It's incredible. Well, God, I got the blessing. What can I say? God's in this, Dad. God's with us in this. Your plan to bless me instead of my brother Jacob, God's for you. Right? And God's with me. The Lord your God granted me success. Then Isaac said to Jacob, come here, right? Please come here. I want to feel you, my son, to know whether are you really my son Esau or not. So Jacob went near to Isaac his father, who felt him and said, the voice is Jacob's voice, right? He's trying to sound like Esau, but there's a difference. The voice is Jacob's voice. But the hands are the hands of Esau. Hairy, right? Hairy hands. Rough hands, right? This isn't the same. And he did not recognize him because his hands were hairy like his brother Esau's hands. So he blessed him. So he was fooled. And he said, are you really my son Esau? And he answered again, I am. Then he said, all right, bring me the food, right? Bring it near me that I can eat of my son's game and bless you. So he brought it near to him and he ate. Then he brought him wine. Here, why don't you drink a little wine too, Dad? Right? Get you a little inebriated, maybe you're a little confused, a little more about who's who. And he drank. Then his father Isaac said to him, come near and kiss me, my son. So he came near and kissed him. And Isaac smelled the smell of his garments, still unsure. It is him. And he blessed him and said, see, the smell of my son is as the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed. Right? May God give you of the dew of heaven and of the fatness of the earth and plenty of grain and wine. Let people serve you and nations bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone who blesses you. So what he's seeking to do here, I think, is he knows the birthright's gone. He knows all of that, but he can still do something for his son. He can associate his son with the blessing of God. He's thinking it's Esau. He can bless him and hope that God would grant him this, that his son would prosper in the earth, it would have the dew of heaven and the fatness of the earth, plenty of grain and wine. And even though the older will serve the younger, he's hoping, I think, to push that down in history, way down, so that Esau himself doesn't experience this. So that for Esau, he himself is Lord over his brothers, and his mother's sons bow down to him. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone who blesses you. He wants God to really be with him. Esau has earned none of this. Esau doesn't care really about any of this. But this is what Isaac is seeking to give to Esau. But he's giving it to Jacob. He doesn't realize. He's given it to Jacob. This is what he thought he had left that he could possibly eke out in terms of a blessing that he could give, something good to give one of his sons that it wasn't already possessed by Jacob. As soon as Isaac had finished blessing Jacob, when Jacob had scarcely gone out from the presence of Isaac his father, Esau his brother came in from his hunting. He then prepared his delicious food and brought it in to his father. And he said to his father, Let my father arise and eat of his son's gain, that you may bless me. And his father Isaac said to him, Who are you? I think the hope was, even though this sounds like Esau now, it's like the hope was, maybe this is now Jacob coming and saying, hey, I heard that you got to eat and you're handing out blessings. My turn, Dad. Right? And he would say something like, I don't have a blessing for you. I've got a birthright for you. Right? You've got a birthright. But the blessing, I don't really have these things that I've already given to Esau. But it's not what happened. He said, I am your son, your firstborn, Esau. And then Isaac trembled very violently because there was no mistaking this was in fact Esau. He realized what had happened. He says, Who was it then that hunted game and brought it to me, and I ate it all before you came, and I have blessed him? Yes, and he shall be blessed. So, like what happens all at once in this violent tremor is the realization, one, that he'd been tricked, two, the realization that, gosh dang it, I tried and I schemed, but God's word became true. The older is going to serve the younger. The younger's got it all. He's got the birthright. He's got this physical blessing. And I already know, because of the way Esau's been living, he's the one who's I'm going to give the blessing of Abraham too. These promises about blessing the nations are going to come to Jacob. Jacob's not a whole lot better than Esau, but Jacob's interested in the blessing in ways that Esau isn't. Esau doesn't care. And so he's got nothing to give him, and he tells him, Who was it that I blessed? And I'm telling you what, as tragic as it is, he's going to get that blessing. I'm not going to take it back now. He recognizes the hand of God in outwitting him, in using his scheming and his wife's scheming and his youngest twin boy's willingness to always be a schemer against him to ensure that God's word does in fact come true. He just kind of like he gives up. All right, he's going to get it. As soon as Esau heard the words of his father, he cried out with an exceedingly great and bitter cry and said to his father, Bless me, even me also, my father. But he said to him, Your brother, he knew who it was, your brother came deceitfully, and he has taken away your blessing. Esau said, Is he not rightly named Jacob? Cheater. Grasper of the heel. What a cheat. Are you kidding me? You were going to give me this blessing, and by the time I went out there and came back, and I'm all ready to give it to you, and he already cheated it away from me. He tricked you, and you're unwilling to undo it. What a cheater. He has cheated me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and behold, now he's taken away my blessing. Well, he didn't cheat you with the birthright. You didn't care about it. You despised it. That's what happened to Esau. The Scripture itself tells us that. It doesn't say, and thus Jacob cheated Esau. It says, thus Esau despised his birthright. But that's not the way Esau wants to characterize it. Oh no, I was cheated. He wasn't cheated. Then he said, Have you not reserved a blessing for me? Surely you've got something left. And Isaac answered and said to Esau, Behold, I have made him lord over you, and all his brothers I have given to him for servants. So you're a servant. And with grain and wine I have sustained him. What can I do for you, my son? I've given him physical prosperity. I've made his brothers servants. I've given him prominence among the family. I've made him lord over you. What am I to do? And Esau said to his father, Have you but one blessing, my father? Bless me, even me also, my father. And Esau lifted up his voice and wept. And so he's saying, Dad, I don't care. Just pronounce a blessing, some sort of blessing. Say the words. Don't just not have anything for me. Speak a blessing to me in some way. Then Isaac, his father, answered and said to him, he sees the temper tantrum that Esau's throwing here. The grown man, right? He's 80. You can figure out the years here, but here's an 87-year-old man here complaining, Don't you have a blessing for me? Even me? Come on, Dad. Like, this is what and then he's lifting up his voice and weeping because he doesn't get this. And Isaac looks at this and answers him and says to him, Here's your blessing. Away from the fatness of the earth shall your dwelling be, and away from the dew of heaven on high. And by your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. But when you grow restless, you shall break his yoke from your neck. The same way you're going out in the fields, going out and hunting game, you're going to have to live by your sword. People are going to be after you. You're going to live a life of war everywhere you go. You're going to have to live by the sword. Defend your life by the sword. Take life by the sword. This is how you're going to live. And this is going to end up, eventually, it's going to be this way until your brother is lord over you. But there's going to come a time, this is the only light at the end of the tunnel, where you'll break his yoke from your neck. And you won't serve him in the same way. Now, verse 41, Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing with which his father had blessed him. And Esau said to himself, the days of mourning for my father are approaching, and then I will kill my brother Jacob. So he hates Jacob because of the blessing with which his father had blessed him. In other words, when Dad went to bless me, he said, away from the fatness of the earth, away from the dew of heaven, by your sword you shall live. Dad, that was the blessing my dad gave me. I hate my brother Jacob because he took the other blessing that was supposed to be for me. And when my dad, I'll bide my time now, but when Dad dies, I'm going to kill him. But the words of her old, he said that to himself, it says. He wasn't out broadcasting and threatening him. He didn't go to Jacob and threaten him, I'm going to kill you when Dad dies. He didn't do that. He was more shrewd than that. He was more calculating than that. But the words of Esau, even though he said it to himself, were overheard, and the words of Esau, her older son, were told then to Rebekah. So she sent and called Jacob, her younger son, and said to him, behold, your brother Esau comforts himself about you by planning to kill you. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice. Arise, flee to Laban, my brother, in Haran, and stay with him a while until your brother's fury turns away, until your brother's anger turns away from you, and he forgets what you have done to him. Then I will send and bring you from there. Why should I be bereft of you both in one day? So her concern is her husband's going to die at some point, and when he does, Esau's going to kill Jacob, and she's going to be bereft of both her husband and her son. Well, so her plan is to get him out of town for a while until Esau cools off. She thinks it's just be maybe a few months, maybe a year, not too long. It ends up being the rest of her life. She never sees her son again. Then Rebekah said to Isaac, goes to her husband and says, I loathe my life because of these Hittite women, Esau's wives. My life is miserable. If Jacob were to marry one of these Hittite women like these, one of the women of the land, what good will my life be to me? We need to get him out of here and find him a real bride, someone who lives not like these people. And we'll read the next 5 verses here, and we'll end with this. Then Isaac called Jacob and blessed him and directed him. So this is now the third blessing he gives to his sons. First one he thought was to Esau. It was all physical, and then also had the protection of God with it. The second one was the negative blessing given to Esau for real this time, and that was a negative blessing. Away from the fatness of the earth, away from the dew of heaven. You don't get any of the things your brother was going to get. Live by the sword, but eventually you'll break that yoke. And then this third blessing, which is the real powerful blessing here. Fully convinced that Jacob would be the one, he blesses him and directs him. He says he blessed him and directs him. And then it's going to explain the directions first, and then it'll go to the blessing. So the directions were, you must not take a wife from the Canaanite women. Arise, go to Padan Aram, to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, and take as your wife from there one of the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother. And then the blessing. God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and multiply you, that you may become a company of peoples. May he give the blessing of Abraham to you and to your offspring with you, that you may take possession of the land of your sojournings that God gave to Abraham. Thus, or in that way, Isaac sent Jacob away, and he went to Padan Aram to Laban, the son of Bethuel the Aramean, the brother of Rebekah, Jacob's and Esau's mother. That's as far as we're going to get today. So we'll be set out then to launch from this fateful day, what happens. We'll see a little bit about Ishmael. We'll see a lot about Jacob. This is where the promise stands. It's not too promising, right? It's not too encouraging to think that this next generation, it looks like it's almost squandered it away. The one on whom everything depends now, Jacob, is a scoundrel. And you think, all the negatives you see about Jacob, you think, well, that's terrible. Like, God's not, let's find somebody more worthy. And you go to Esau, and he's as bad, and only it's even worse because he doesn't even care. At least Jacob will cheat to get the blessing, but at least he wants the blessing. Jacob will cheat to get the birthright. At least he wants it. Esau doesn't even care. Think of this, for all of Jacob's scheming and being the kind of guy who just wants this and wants that and wants all the things he's still unmarried. He didn't take a bride. He didn't want one of those women. Esau was more than happy to have them. It's really amazing. Like as many of, and there are many bad things we could say about Jacob. There are many of them. He's 87 years old, never married, because there wasn't a worthy woman. It's amazing. Didn't stop Esau. He's got several wives, and he's getting ready to get a few more. It's crazy. And so, anyway, the situation for the family is not good. There's division, there's tension. Brother wants to kill brother. And this is amazing. Another thing to think about, the one whom receives the blessing of Abraham is sent out of the promised land. He's sent away. He doesn't dwell in the promised land anymore. So now the one who's received the blessing, the one who's heir to the promises, is not even in the land. And if he gets back to the land, there's a warrant out for his death. Wanted, dead or alive. Jacob, signed by Esau. Right? It's frightening. And Esau's the one making connections in the land too. He's the one marrying, kind of making connections and getting in with their religion and their way of life. It's not good. So we see kind of this buildup of obstacles. And yet, curiously, this is amazing. Think about this. On the one hand, you could read this and think it's becoming less and less likely that the promises come true. But then on the other hand, you could look at it and say, God's words about what He said would happen is coming to fruition more and more clearly. It's amazing. It's like God's handicapping Himself before He makes good on all the promises. He's saying, now before I make good on it, I want you to know the path it's going to take a little bit. Here's this wandering path, and when we wander so bad, don't think I've lost sight of where my goal is. And then all of a sudden you start reading the story and you're wandering that exact path that He said. You can't imagine how it's going to end up where He said it's going to end up, but we're on the path He said we're going to be on. And that's encouraging. Well, that's all I have for today. Admittedly, we haven't reached the end and the conclusion of this account. So to slow down and draw lessons out of all these things now, we did it before, but to do it now would be add another hour onto the message. So we're going to leave it at that. Are there any questions or comments with regard to the text or things maybe I didn't go over or things I did you just want some more detail or something? Anything that way?